Today we are talking about using SQL stored procedures in Access. We're going to talk a little bit about ADO. I did put a couple links here to references about a little bit about what ADO is, and some references that go more into detail about some of the specific objects that we are going to talk about today, as well as the items that we are going to talk about. Also, just a note before we start here, the last slide I have today gives a couple links from a great presentation that Juan Soto did for one of our other Access user groups. I think it might have been the Michigan group. It was maybe about a year ago. And that some of the things that I'm covering today overlap with that talk. Some of the things in that talk are different. And so it would be also benefit you to take a look at the YouTube recording that you can get to from the Access User Groups website. I think you have to go to the individual groups subsite and then the videos on there, and you can see past topic videos. And then there are a couple references that he gave during that talk that I'm also going to provide links to at the end of this on the last slide, because they are some shortcuts and things to what some good tips on to further talk about the subject of using stored procedures in SQL from an Access database. So as a basic introduction to ADO, ADO stands for Activex Data Objects. They are a language-neutral object model, and they expose data raised by an underlying OLE-DB provider. It's also a part of the Microsoft Data Access components, which you can install, and that does more than just ADO, but that is one piece of that. The specific objects that we are going to talk about today are the connection object, the command object, parameters to the command object, and using the record sets with SQL stored procedures. And then that's the end of that. So let me pull up my examples here today. So in this example, I have an Access database, and this happens to be a contacts database, which I have shown before, and the tables that are in here are local tables. But you could also link to a SQL server directly, to create linked tables if you wanted to. Or what I like to do with SQL Server is for my data, I like to use stored procedures to return the data. And you could do these, and indeed on the video of the presentation that Juan gave several months ago, he shows you an example. You could do these actually as a pass-through query. Your query could, instead of saying select star from table whatever, your query could say execute the stored procedure name. And so you could execute a stored procedure by simply using a pass-through query where the connection to the query is your connection to your SQL database. But for this purpose of this talk today, I'm going to go through and use the actual connection objects and the command objects. And the reason I do that is I feel like it gives you a little bit more control. And the more complicated your stored procedures are, the more parameters you have and that kind of thing, the more I advise using the connection objects otherwise, you can use just a pass-through query. So the first example I have is of using the connection object. Before we actually start that, I'm just going to mention, in order to use the objects and use them with IntelliSense and the definition of the structure, which is the ADO-DB structure, you first need to go and create a reference. And the reference should be to one of the Microsoft Activex data objects. I generally am using 6.1 right now. Depending upon the version of the applications that you have, we go back to 2.8 and then on back. There are some clients that I'm still using 2.8 on, but most of them I'm now using 6.1 for the reference. In general, you want to go to your oldest common point. That most of the references are forward compatible, but not always backward compatible. So the first thing you need to do is create that reference in order to be able to use the IntelliSense here. And because the connection part I'm going to use in my other routines, I've set that up at the beginning of my module as a public connection. And you do need to use the word new in front of it so that you actually create the memory space for the connection. Ben is asking a question here. How do we know what version of ADO your clients are using? I think that there is a map. I will see if I can get that towards the end of this. It might actually be on one of these that I already gave you. Let me go back to my PowerPoint here. Nope, neither of these links provides a good reference to that. So I will see if I can find that, if anything, as a follow-up to our conversation here. Okay, so the connection object itself has, various different properties. The ones that I like to use are the command timeout. The default for the command timeout is 15 seconds, and it's how long to wait in seconds for the connection to open. So if it took longer than 15 seconds, which is the default, to establish the connection with your SQL Server, then you would get a timeout error. And you can use 0. That disables the timeout and essentially waits forever. I don't know that I would necessarily recommend that, but that is an option. I will ask you, if you do not need to say something right now, if you would go ahead and mute your microphone. I see one of our participants does not have their microphone muted. That way we don't have background noise. But please feel free during today's discussion to go ahead and just come out and ask questions, or I'm trying to watch the chat board too if you've got specific questions. Then we also have the mode for the connection. And that is things like read or read-write, and there is defined characteristics for that. So if you start typing, in your mode, you will get the list of types here. With most of my connections, I use read-write connections. If you had, just a reporting application or something like that, then you would be safer to use the read only connection. And then you want your connection string. And I've actually listed 2 connection strings here. The connection string that's enabled here, that's the more modern way to do this. And that's not using the OLDB type OLEDD is being phased out, supposedly. They haven't really said exactly when they're going to phase it out. The rumor originally was that it was going to be after this latest release of SQL Server. I don't think we have any definite answer from Microsoft that it's definitely been phased out yet in anything, but they say that it's coming. So while this connection string syntax will work right now, as you're building new applications, you should strive to use the newer syntax. And that is with using the native, SQL native connection. So you specify the provider, which is the SQL native client 11, I believe, and then the server, which is your server, SQL server name. This happens to be mine. And the database that you want to connect to, in this case, it's the contacts database. And then depending upon your security, in this case, I use, hello, welcome. I would ask you to try to mute your voice sound, if you could, please, unless you're wanting to contribute something and ask a question. Thank you so much. So the integrated security is the Windows security. So this particular SQL Server is set up using Windows Integrated Server security, rather. If you are not using that, then you would have a password and a username and a password in place of that. And there's other references in the library here, which is this is one of the links that I gave you in that first slide with a whole reference. You'll find other examples of the types of things in the connection object, for example, that you can use besides, the integrated security. So that's all there is to that. And then you do open in order to open it. And so if I run this subroutine, it will open a connection to that server. And then if I do a test here on ocon.state, I should hopefully see that, yes, it's 1, which means that it is open. And then if you were done, with your whatever you were doing, then it would be in good taste to close the connection with an ocon.close and then set the variable ocon equal to nothing. The second example I'm going to give is to just simply call a stored procedure. And you'll notice that I am using as a connection here the ocon, or the connection that I just established and opened in the first example. So before you can call a stored procedure using an ADOB command object, you have to first have an open connection to the database itself. So we just set up a command object here with by declaring the variable, and again we're using the new in front of the command object or command type. And then I like to use with. You don't have to. You could say command object dot active connection or whatever, but that makes it a little simpler. So you set the connection here for the command object to your open connection, and then the type to stored procedure. And then again, there's a timeout that can be associated with this. The timeout is in seconds, and the default is 30 seconds. In this case, I've upped it to 60 seconds in case, it's a longer stored procedure. I'm sorry. For those who are getting here late, today's topic is accessing or using SQL stored procedures from Microsoft Access. So that's what we're talking about here today, is how to call SQL stored procedures from Microsoft Access. We've talked already about the command or connection object and how to connect to the SQL database, and now we're talking about how to actually call the stored procedure. And then in the command text field, you set the name of the stored procedure, and you do want to make sure that you use the SQL. I'm just drawing a total mental blank here. The yeah. If it's not DVO, whatever, schema, there we go, the SQL schema as a preface to that. I believe if you don't put any schema in front of the dot, it will assume it's a DVO schema command. But if you happen to use other schemas in your SQL Server, you want to make sure you put the schema name and dot the stored procedure name. And then you just simply call the execute method, and that executes the stored procedure. So if we call this here, then this will actually execute the stored procedure, and then you would do whatever you needed to with that stored procedure's results, and or some of them don't have results; they just do something. If, for example, you have a stored procedure, maybe your access form has the current differential between your costs and your prices, and you want to mark stuff up, your current markup, and you want to change your markup from 30% to 35% for everything in your price database, then you could have a command, for example, and in that case you would probably send it the new markup value, that it wouldn't return any result set at all. All it would do is go in and, run a procedure that updated that markup for everything in your database or whatever. You could do the same thing theoretically with an update statement, but it's nice sometimes to have better control, and some things are more complicated. In general, I also like to keep even selects for an access query in stored procedures in SQL, and one of the reasons I do that is it helps keep down the number of times that I have to release an actual and roll out a new Access application. Because if the fields that we're showing and whatnot on the screen are not changing, just maybe a tweak to the underlying source, and maybe the users have asked for a different sort criteria, or some kind of change that we wouldn't necessarily have to roll out a new version of the Access database, then those changes could be made in SQL only. And so that's one of the reasons I like keeping things in stored procedures. So then as a cleanup, you should, of course, set things, your command or your object, rather, to nothing at the end of that. The next example shows what you would do if you had parameters. And I've seen a lot of examples where people actually dim the parameters as ADO the parameters. You can do that. You can do something like this. Something like that, and then set your parameters, and then do the parameters.append down here. But you can also create parameters all together in one line, and I just prefer doing that. It seems less time-consuming and less messy. So this first section here is identical to what we did before, all the way up to the command text. And this time, except for I think we're calling a slightly different stored procedure, this one selected all the contacts, and this is going to select a specific contact, and it has a parameter and the parameter happens to be the ID that you pass it in. So this here then appends to the parameters collection. And you could do this, I have an example commented out here below, one after the other for however many parameters you have for that stored procedure. So there's two pieces of it. There's the append part, and then there's the create part. So the create part here has the syntax that we have the name of the parameter first. So ID here is the name of the parameter, and we put that in quotes. And then the type of parameter. And you can see down in my other example here, that was a varchar type in another way of doing it. Whether the parameter is an input or output parameter. And I'll show you an example of an output in another example here. But for this purposes, these are input parameters to the stored procedure. And then the next spot is for the size for integers and Booleans and date times and stuff like that. You don't have to put a size. You can just leave that blank. But if you have something like varchar, then you have to put the size or the length of the varchar parameter in. And then the value of the parameter. And so in this case, it's 1. You could also, if you had something on your form, a field on your form, you could use like me dot whatever the field name was, instead. So that's all you need for that, and then you execute it just like that. And go ahead and do that. And then the next example here actually, what good is it to, just run a stored procedure? And as I said before, sometimes it is. Sometimes you're running a stored procedure that just does something, like perhaps marks up everything to a change percentage or something like that. But other times you want to use the results of your stored procedure to fill a form, or to parse through a record set and do something, specific with that record set. So if you're going to do that, then in addition to the command object, you also need to use a record set object. So you do that just like you would the command, except for you define it as a record set type. And then your stored procedure is the same. In this case, we're going to use that second example where we're selecting only one contact. And this time, instead of calling command object execute, like we did here, we actually set the record set variable to be equal to the command object execute results by using syntax like this. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And in this case, we could then, see, for example, that our record set was not at the end. We do have values in there. Depending upon your record set type, you can get record count for some of them. I don't think you can for this one. Nope, not for this one. You could see, for example, here on the fields, how many fields you had, or things like the name of the first field. Oops, I want one. Name. So that happens to be company. You might do things like, we know that the ID is probably part of this, so we would set ID, and we want to return the value. So you could peruse through this. Oops, gotta have ending parentheses here, or quotes, where we got the value 1, which is of course what you would expect because we asked to look up the contact where the ID equals 1. And then whenever you were done doing whatever you wanted to with your record set, then you would close the record set and set it to nothing and the command object to nothing as well. Questions? I see we have a couple here. Let me go ahead and stop and look at that. Okay. Yes, definitely. Error trapping if things fail is a great idea. I did not put that in here, but I am going to discuss here on the next example a return result of the stored procedure. So that's one way. If you're doing error trapping in SQL itself, and you know, the clean way to do that is to return a value from the stored procedure, and the common practice is to return 0 if it executes successfully, and some other error value, which is usually greater than 0, and often related to the SQL exception if there is an error during the processing. And so I'm going to show you in the next example how to look at that return value. And certainly, yes, if you are going to use stored procedures, then you have to know or learn T-SQL to do them, or be given stored procedures that someone else has written for you. And you just, you know, here's the parameters, here's how you use them. That's an option as well. How large a varchar can ADO support from the SQL database? So this question, I'm just going to read the question in entirety here, because I think there might be two parts to it. It says, how large a varchar can ADO support from the SQL database? For example, if there's a 10K memo stored in SQL database, can ADO return the whole contents, or is there a physical limit that ADO can return? And if so, what's the max size it can return? So maybe this is only one question. There's probably two things that you should consider, and one is what's the limit on the parameters that you can pass in, and then second, what is the limit on what you can get back? So you do definitely have to be a little bit careful about, you know, SQL has different variables and different types than Access does. And so you're going to be sending variables as your parameters and or interpreting results from a returned record set if the stored procedure returns a record set. If the stored procedure, not all of them do return a record set, but if they have a clause in them that says something like select whatever from whatever table, and so if you were to run that stored procedure on the SQL server and you were to get a list of rows, that means that that stored procedure returns a record set. Not all of them do. Some of them may just return a return value. But if they return a record set, then you can do something like this where you set a record set equal to the results and then you know, interpret that result or use that result in whatever way you want to in Access. So in either case, when you're passing data to SQL Server or when you're getting data from SQL Server, you do need to be careful about the differentiation in variable types from Access to SQL Server. And that can be as simple as in Access, an integer is only 32,000, however many characters. But in SQL, an integer in SQL is much larger. So in most cases, when you're dealing with Access, on the Access size, you use a long variable whereas in SQL it's an integer. So you do have to be aware of that, and I would suggest that you maybe Google the differentiation between the two, between SQL and Access and a particular variable type, to kind of give you the exact what you should use here and there, and there are some good references on that. I will try to also, as a follow-up to this, pull up a good one that has a variety. I'm just going to take notes on that. So I want to reference to variable type conversions, and then also one to the reference version numbers. So as far as the varchars, SQL has a varchar max, and so in Access, in general, if you go over 256, then you have to go to a memo type. So usually I stick with relating an Access memo type to SQL varchar 8000. That's kind of the practice that I use. But I'm not aware of specific, where you get a record set object and you can't read the whole thing in SQL. I haven't actually encountered that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does exist, and there is some kind of maximum that you can actually see. So you will have to be cognizant of that if you have a very large-sized variable. You certainly have limits on the Access side. If you were going to set it to an Access memo or an Access variable of some type, you need to check maybe the length of it in your field. Like if you're going to be assigning an Access field to one of the fields in your return result sets, you would want to be careful about your Access setup and maybe check the length. And if it was bigger than a certain amount that your Access variable could handle, then you would need to take the left so many characters or something like that. So this is definitely something that you need to be aware of if you're transferring data back and forth. So anyway, this record set you can use as anything, or you do whatever you want to with. So then the next example that I'm going to go over here has the return values. And you can use or get return values from SQL stored procedures in two ways. One is through actually using the return value from the stored procedure. And in order to do that, you have to do two things. One is to specifically create a parameter that is called return_value. And then the second thing is that parameter has to be the first parameter that you declare. So you notice that it also is a special type, and that is the AD param return value. So if you do that, if you set up that return value, then after you execute the command here, you can check on the return value. And for example, in this is one of the types of error checking you could do. If that stored procedure returned a return value of 0, and we assume that that means that it completed successfully, then you would do whatever in your program. If it didn't return a 0, then it's common practice to do something like pop up a message box saying that there was an error and what the value of the error was, so that you could know a little bit about what was wrong and what course of action you should take if there was a failure in the stored procedure. Maybe there's, whatever it might be. But certainly as a programmer, you'd use that information to debug and then hopefully you have your users trained to report those errors, or you might have some kind of error tracking, that you use in your project, and you would record that error as such and be notified, whatever you typically use for errors. Or there might be specific errors, hopefully if there's ranges of parameters that, only make sense, you've done that error trapping ahead of time, before you've called your stored procedure and told your users, the value of the new percentage has to be between 1 and 99, or whatever your parameters are, and your pre-error checking. Hopefully you've done that ahead of time before you call your stored procedure. The other way to return information from your SQL stored procedure is to use an output parameter, like I've done in this line. And in order to do that, you need to have, first of all, a variable of some type, which this is set up here at the beginning, to return that into, and then you need to declare it as type 80 param output. And that doesn't have to be in any order. In general, the parameters should be in the same order as your stored procedure is named, although I believe SQL does an actual mapping for name to name. So if you had them mixed up, I think it still handles them properly, but in general, I put them in the same order that they are declared in the stored procedure. So in something like this, for example, if you had say a stored procedure which added a row to a table and returned then the identity value of that new row, then you might pass the identity back in this output parameter, whatever the name would be. And here I told you that, and bad practice here. This is for reasonable error checking purposes. If you are returning an integer from SQL Server, you should put it into a long value in Access because of the size differentiation. So we should probably, of course, have this named L instead of I, just for clarity's sake here. But you still use whatever it is in the SQL. This is the same syntax that you would in SQL. So if it's a SQL integer, then you would use AD integer as the type. So the types that you use in your parameters need to match the SQL types, not the Access types. So those are two ways to get values from SQL. You can also trap, if you were, just to be complete on the error trapping, you can use something like this. Oops. Sorry, get my syntax right here. So you might also use this and then check your errors here where you would, display your errors, something like this instead of the return value. You might get your error.number or description. And there are a couple errors that are typically returned as well, if there's an error in there, or perhaps not an actual error returned by the stored procedure, but an error in communicating, or maybe it can't find the stored procedure or something like that, then you would get and you would move to this error trap. So if, let me just say that again to be clear. So if the stored procedure completes and returns a value that is not, a return value here that's not 0, then that doesn't give you an access error. In other words, error.number would still be 0 in that case. But if you actually had trouble communicating and doing the execute itself, then you would get an access trapped error, like an error number. And that might be stuff like, that procedure doesn't exist or something like that, versus there was some problem during the SQL computation or completion of the stored procedure. And in that case, you would expect SQL to have returned you a value that was something like 0. So one of our attendees here did format some or paste some information from the web. So he is saying that it does say maximum 8,000 characters for a fixed width character string. That's interesting. And variable and varchar max looks like it's a very large number of characters, so that would be what to use in there. And 2 gigabytes of text data is the maximum size. He had an example before where he had, I think, a 10 megabyte. I'm trying to find the 10K, sorry. So yeah, 2 gigabytes of text data. So there is definitely limitations out there if you Google what those limitations are. Okay, so the final example I want to show you then is using a record set as a form record source. So in this case, and I've kind of commented out some of that, but you can and the reason I did that is because I don't have a particular form that if you're going to use that, if you're going to use this in setting a form record set, you would not just want this to be a subroutine in a module. You would want this subroutine to be actually in your form someplace so that you were nested within your form and you could set me, which is your form's record set. So the same type of thing here we've done, we've called the routine here. In this case, if you want to, and I provide this for a little extra, this is not something that has to be done commonly, but recently I struggled with one stored procedure that had kept returning as a default a non-updatable record set. And I'm sure you've gotten those before, even within Access. You have to be very careful. You have to, join on keys and that kind of thing to make things updatable. But in this case, my stored procedure I thought was pretty simple, but Access didn't like it and it didn't think it was updatable. So I wanted to do a couple things with the record set to make sure that it was updatable. And there's a couple parameters in the record set that you can set. However, you can only set these parameters, the cursor type and the lock type on a record set, before you open it. So in this case, instead of using the normal syntax, which is this, the set record set equal to the execute results of the command object, I actually called record set open with the command object. And that essentially then executes the command object and then sets it back. But that allows you to set certain characteristics of the record set ahead of time and have those stick. If you don't do that, then those record sets parameters get set or not parameters, but properties get set up to their defaults when you do this, the record set equal to object command execute. Then the cursor type and the lock type would get set, the record set would get set to the default cursor type and lock type, which are not AD open key set or AD lock batch optimistic. If you are going to then use that record set, got an error here because I copied from something else, as the source of your form, then you could do set your form record set equal to that record set. And in this case, I also use the unique table to make sure that, and you only need to do this if you run into non-updatable problems in Access, so that it knows exactly what table it's going for as far as updating. You can use that. And then depending upon your form, if it's just a search form or something where you're not going to be updating records, then I like to actually close the record set object after I set my form record set to it. That keeps the SQL amount of resources that SQL is using down to more of a minimum. If you're not going to be updating it, that record set does not need to be open. Access just has a copy of it. You're going to, be going and doing things, maybe opening another form based on, one of the lines that they click on or whatever you're doing. Or if you're just displaying information like, for reporting purposes or, viewing purposes, no reason to have it open if you're not going to update it. So then in that case, I would close the record set right after I set it to the record set for the individual form. All right, so we are getting down 10 minutes left here. I'm going to open it up for other questions. I think I've answered most of those that we've had during the call here. And does anyone else have any questions about SQL and using SQL stored procedures with Access? I'm going to put this back up here. There we go. So this is just resources from today. This is how you reach me. And then this references Juan Soto's blog. Again, there are two pieces that I found very interesting. He does mention them in a similar talk that he gave several months ago for one of the other Access user groups. There's some easy ways to use record sets and commands in Access and not do this repetitive declaring of everything. And he gives some helpful hints about that from the first link here in his blog. And then also talks a little bit about performance issues with SQL Server, and that's more in reference to the different types of connection strings and why you would use the more updated native connection type as opposed to the older EDB connection types and what the advantages in performance was. Okay, sounds good. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording then, and I will try to post on the blog for this both the slides from today and also the chat session and the questions and answers for that. And then maybe not right away, but before the end of the day today, I'll try to get those other two references up there as well. Thank you all so much for attending today, and I hope you can join us soon for another